Millard, and mine was a little different than most people's so far because most people's has been like a autobiography that the person who made the education, like the contribute to education was written by them, but mine's a little different. Mine is about Montessori education, which was obviously originated by Maria Montessori, but it was written by Angeline Millard, and so I'll tell you a little bit about both of them. Maria Montessori she's very old. She was obviously way before all of us in here, and so she grew up in Rome, Italy most of her life, but she traveled around a lot to many different parts with her family. She was very different than most women at that time because she studied engineering and physics and math. She went to medicine. She got a lot of undergrads and things, a bunch of masters. She finally ended up with a degree in natural sciences, which is what led her to teaching. They refer to them as retarded children in the book, but it's kind of old, and so now we refer to them as special needs children. And so that's basically where most of her contributes to education kind of began. And a little bit about Angeline Millard. She loves her some Maria Montessori. She has written multiple essays and stuff on her. She still gives speeches to this day about her. And so this book is just a lot of her findings on exactly what she likes best about Montessori education. She's a professor of psychology at University of Virginia currently, and she's studied Montessori for more than 2 decades, but this book was written in 2005, and she's still getting them today, so we can kind of say like 3 decades now. And then the main reason she did this was just to write basically like a contribution to her, because she just idolized her because she was so far ahead of her time at that time. Okay, so just a little bit about the book. Millard wrote this just to explain how science and technology that Maria had back then wasn't existing, but her ideas can still be used today, and it's really cool that she goes into much detail about that, and just to explain how she was so far ahead of her time and she didn't know what was going to happen, but yet we're still using these today. And one of the quotes from the book that Millard uses is she says that Montessori sees the school as a factory and the child as a blank slate. And so 100 years ago, Maria Montessori was the first female physician in Italy, and she devised a very different method of educating children, which was based on observations, how they naturally learn. And that's what this whole book is about, is how teaching children the way they would naturally want to learn, which encourages them to want to learn more for what they want. Okay, so what exactly is Montessori education? The straight-out book definition is a method of education that's based on self-direct activity and hands-on learning and collaborative play. That is a picture of what a Montessori classroom would look like. It's obviously very different than any classroom probably most of us have ever been in. There's no desk, there's no table and chairs that you have to sit at. It's filled with a bunch of different activities and tools that kids will just get to play with, basically. The classroom setup is it's in age groups, not in grades. Like, you don't have first, second, third grade. You're in grades 3 through 6 together, and then 6 to 9, and then 9 to 12. That's kind of cut off there. And you're basically just kind of free to roam around and do what you want in the classroom, which is very different than obviously anything that I've ever been in. And so they get to just walk around, see an activity that catches their eye, and play with them. And there's one teacher to over 30 students at a time, which is kind of overwhelming to me, but it's not overwhelming to these teachers that teach at it. Has anybody ever heard of Montessori education? Mm-hmm. Okay, some yeses, lots of no's. I had never heard of it. I didn't know it was a thing. I didn't even know. I was like, we don't have these in Mississippi. Googled it. We have like 8 or 9 schools in Mississippi, if you're wondering. And so, ironically, I was actually working on this PowerPoint at my sorority house that I live at, and this girl, she comes up, she's like, what are you doing? And I was like, working on a PowerPoint on Montessori education, kind of like jokingly saying she had no idea what I'm talking about. And she was like, oh, I went to a Montessori school. And I was like, seriously? She's from Arkansas. And she went to a Montessori school till basically 3 to 6. And so I got to sit down and like ask a question about it, so I was like really amazed that I actually knew someone that went there. And she said, so I was like, so is it really, like I showed her this PowerPoint slide, and I was like, is this really what it looks like? And she was like, yes, that's almost identical to what my classroom looked like. And one of the cool things that she said is that she vividly remembers, I was like, did you like it? And she was like, I mean, 3 to 6, yeah, I loved it. Like, that's just, I learned a lot. And so one of the cool things that she said was whenever she would go in for like one day, she said she vividly remembers like just being stuck on something for 2 or 3 days. So, and that's the main base of this. She would go in and let's say she found some cool like building blocks or something on one day. She said she would just get stuck on that for 3 or 4 days, and then she would get tired of it, and then she'd move on to the next thing. And so as a teacher, when you notice that a student goes to something new and they start getting stuck on it, that's how they teach them to learn, is because then they'll go up to them while they're playing with that and say, hey, well, this is what this means, and this is what you're supposed to learn from these tools. And from this little building block, you can learn many different things, and I have an example later on. And so I just thought that was really cool that I got to see like a little hands-on experience of that. So there's 8 major principles of Montessori education. Choice, interest, motivation all kind of go together. Choice, they are freely get to choose whatever they want. And quotes or things from the book that I thought were like main key points. Freedom of individual work is found to be the basis of internal discipline. When you get to choose what you want to learn, you're going to be more interested in it, which goes into the next thing. So they get to choose what they're doing. One chooses what to do, what they're interested in. So if you're interested in those building blocks for that day and you go choose to do that, then you're going to have an interest in learning what that means and how you can relate to it. So they learn not because they have to memorize for a test, which is probably what most of us have done. We memorize something, we learn it, we get lectured on it, we test on it, we forget it, and we don't ever base it into real life. And so they're interested in what they're learning about. And so if you get to choose it and you have an interest in it, then you're more motivated in it. And that's the third point is motivation. They do schoolwork and behave positively because they're internally motivated about it. If you're more motivated to learn something, then you're going to learn it and you're going to understand it more and you're going to want to do it. And I thought this was really interesting is misbehavior disappears when they begin to focus and move on their own. Montessori schools, there's no like, hey, you're in trouble, go sit in the hall. They don't grade tests. There's no red marks all over the test. They don't do any kind of discipline like that because they don't need to. If you took a random group of 6-year-olds that have been in regular schooling and you put them in a Montessori classroom, it would be mass chaos because they would see toys and they would just run around and play with it. But if you start in a Montessori school at age 3, then you're disciplined enough and you don't have to be in trouble. Like, you know that you're supposed to sit quietly and play with these toys and learn about them, and there's no like discipline. I just thought that was really interesting. Number 4 is learning from your peers. Obviously, there's different age groups, 3 to 6, and so the younger ones easily learn from the older ones. If you know that some kid's older than you and they're playing with toys and you think they're cool, you're going to go play with them. And in turn, the older one is going to teach you about what that is and about that toy, which moves into the meaningful context for learning. Traditional schooling is sometimes criticized for not being meaningful in the sense of not being obviously related to real life. I'm going to teach math, so obviously there's going to be so many times when students goes, when am I going to need to know how to graph a cosine function later in life? Mm-hmm. And so that's a hard question to answer on a lot of things because most of the time your answer is, well, you need this in math in college. And so, but students in Montessori schools, they relate each activity to something in real life and they put like a picture with it. And so that's why they see it as more meaningful instead of just a graph of something. Adult interaction styles and child outcomes. Teachers for Montessori schools have to be very special people. I just picture teachers being the sweet, sincere voice and having complete control of the classroom by just going, and they just pay attention. So I feel like that's where I would struggle because I'm secondary education, so I want to teach high school where kids where I can say, hey, sit down and shut up, and then don't go tell their mom that I said a cuss word by saying shut up. And so I feel like, so teachers, they definitely have to have a very warm and sensitive to be able to teach one-on-one and then also oversee 30 plus kids, which goes straight into the order of the environment. These rooms are extremely organized and there's nothing but order. There's no mass chaos in these classrooms. And then lastly, education for the children. Common cultural school's attitude is that school is painful and not particularly fun. I know that Lillard interest got me drawn into the book because the first 3 or 4 the first like chapter and a half, I guess, is she just starts spitting out bad things about schools. And that just drew me in because she was like, kids just sit down and they get lectured at and they take notes and then they test on it and they forget it. And so she's just going into all these things that like basically you would naturally hate about school. And she was like, and that's why Montessori education is so much more successful than this, because it's education for the children and not just them sitting down and being lectured. This is an example of math in Montessori. This is how they would learn the Pythagorean theorem, and for non-math students, the Pythagorean theorem is a squared plus b squared is c squared, which is used to measure the sides of a triangle. So this is an example. I had to combine 2 pictures, so I couldn't find one just like in the book. But pretend the top one and the bottom one are mixed. So it's just like the little Lego pieces or little blocks, but it has that many as the bottom. And so the kids would see this, and they would see the small part, and they would put their 9 little squares that would go in those squares in the bottom one. And then they would do the same thing for this side, and they would realize, oh, there's 16 over here, and there's 4 over here, or there's 9 over there. And so they would see that 3 squared is 9 and 4 squared is 16, and they could add those up, and they realize, oh, it equals 25 over there, and so 3 squared plus 4 squared is 5 squared. And so to me, if I taught that in a 10th grade geometry class for kids who've never been in Montessori, they're not going to see that as well as a kid who's grown up in Montessori and sees a more real life formula. So the point of this is to take an abstract formula that doesn't have a meaning and give it a specific meaning in their head. And so this didn't make sense to me at first until I started kind of realizing that, okay, you definitely have to grow up in Montessori education to kind of understand that, because I feel like that probably most of y'all in this room doesn't make much sense. But they see things and it takes away from just this abstract meaning and it gives it a deeper meaning, which relates to the Common Core, this is the Common Core State Standards of Mississippi for math, and underline the important part. To abstract a given situation and represent it symbolically and manipulate the representing symbols as if they have a life of their own, which is exactly what Montessori education does. It takes all this abstract meaning and abstract formulas that you feel like you can't use in real life, and it puts it into a picture so that the kids can see, oh, this does have an actual meaning. I remember that from my building blocks. That means this is how I find the sides of a triangle. And so it just kind of all represents, so it's not just all abstract things. And I was to end with the critical perspective, and I just put another little cute picture of classroom because I just picture kids sitting in circles in the classrooms, and that's what they do. And so the book was very detailed, but I guess it wasn't in a bad detail. The chapters were just long because she had so much information, like in each chapter about choice. She had a choice in kindergarten, choice in elementary, choice in high school, and then how it relates back to this, and the critical perspective of this. And so it was a lot, but it was interesting. For me, I can relate it to my math easily because obviously there was a bunch of math examples and things like that. But it was hard. I'm secondary ed, so it's hard to relate Montessori education to high school education. But if I end up teaching middle school somehow, I could definitely take some of those exercises and do it with my middle schoolers because they like more hands-on learning than high school. If I was teaching calculus and brought out some building blocks, my seniors wouldn't really like to build things. So that's one of the things. And also, it was written in 2005, and so technology, when she says caught up with science technology, she isn't caught up to current science technology. So I'm sure she definitely has written some things now, but it will be interesting to see how Montessori schools would use like iPads and computers now, because those are so key, but they weren't as huge in 2005. But overall, I thought it was interesting because it was something I'd never heard of. So I'm glad I got to be educated in something that I never heard of. So.